The wind howled across the open tundra that stretched north of the wall, a place where sunlight felt like the memory of a distant age. The ice itself seemed to whisper of old secrets, of sworn vows and broken pacts. Few living souls dared wander there, and those who did often failed to return. Yet on this night, something stirred under the waning moon. Something older than men, older than the tragedies and triumphs that shaped the Seven Kingdoms. Glimpsed by the faintest starlight, a mounted figure sat astride an undead horse atop a gentle rise, staring down at the wall's ruined remains. The Night King had come again. It had been believed he was destroyed for all time when the last great battle was fought before the gates of Winterfell. The valiant stood their ground against him, aided by dragons and direwolves, flaming swords and practiced steel, and for a moment, hope had flickered through the darkness. The legends claimed that Arya Stark delivered the fatal blow, and in an instant, the dark tide of undead collapsed. The living hailed it as the dawn of a new era, an era free of the threat from the far north. But time, as it always did, revealed more complicated truths. Centuries of unknown magics had shaped this being, a creature less a mortal man than an embodiment of ice and death. In the commotion and relief following that fateful dawn, the remnants of the White Walkers had scattered, fragments of the old power slipping into ice-laden cracks. And the Night King, though seemingly extinguished, had left behind the faintest echo of his presence. All believed him gone, yet there are forces in the world that do not bend easily to mortal designs. Slowly, quietly, in a place where even the sun feared to linger, he took form once more. Years passed, decades, the living forgot. Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, once soared above the battlefield on the wings of fire and fury. But after the Great War, she was gone too, cast down in a storm of betrayal and heartbreak. Jon Snow vanished into the wilderness, accompanied by the free folk, disillusioned by the machinations of southern politics. The realm shifted, new rulers rose, old houses fell, and still the memory of the Night King faded into bedtime stories to scare children. The known world's attention had turned south again, to the Iron Throne, to the tangled lines of succession, to the ever-shifting feuds of lords and ladies. Yet quietly, in the darkness north of the wall, whispers grew of a new threat. Rangers who ventured too far reported hearing crackling echoes at night, seeing flickers of movement among the shifting drifts of snow. The first sightings were dismissed as fancy, tales conjured by cold and fear. Then came the vanishings. Settlements of free folk that had re-established themselves near the gift disappeared, leaving only twisted remnants of broken doors, scattered footprints, and a deafening silence. In time, one survivor emerged from the gloom, half-frozen and near death. His hair had turned white from terror, and his eyes were haunted by the horrors he'd seen. Stammering in half-senseless fragments, he spoke of a cold so profound it smothered all warmth, of pale figures moving in the night, and of a presence that gazed upon the living with eerie intelligence. Before succumbing to his injuries, he uttered one final, whispered word that chilled the hearts of those who heard it: "Night King." As word spread, dread began to seep back into the hearts of the northern folk. The lords of Winterfell, descendants of the great Starks, gathered in their halls, uncertain how to react. Could it be the same ancient evil? Every scrap of logic insisted that the Night King had been destroyed beyond return. The North had never been the same after that final showdown. Countless lives had been lost. Memories of that horror still gnawed at older folk who lived through it. Yet here was a half-mad survivor repeating that dreadful name. 2 ravens flew south with ominous messages, seeking counsel from King's Landing. But the monarchy in the capital was enmeshed in its own concerns. Wars in the west, rebellions in the east, plague in the ports. The rumor of a returning Night King sounded like an old wives' tale to them. They had spent fortunes rebuilding, forging alliances, and rewriting the stories of the past to put them in a flattering light. The possibility of another northern menace was an unwelcome reminder of fear and chaos. To quell it, the crown dismissed the rumor as the ravings of a deranged man. The official word came back: "Hold steady. Do not send men or resources on a ghost hunt." "We have enough problems in the realm," the message read, without chasing phantoms of an old war. But the North knew better. Experience had taught them the dangers of ignoring what lurked beyond the wall. So the Northerners tightened their defenses, quietly sending out their own rangers and scouts. Weeks turned into months. The cold deepened, creeping slowly further south. Harvests suffered. Even with the new generation's zeal for prosperity, the Great War's veterans recognized the signs. Quietly, Winterfell and its neighboring houses began arming themselves once more, forging alliances with the free folk that had resettled on both sides of the wall's remnants. All the while, the question silently circled in every mindful head. If the Night King truly had returned, how? By what sorcery had his defeat been undone? The answer lay in a secret that began to stir across the sea, in the last place anyone might expect. Among the scattered threads of House Targaryen's legacy, one fragile line had survived in quiet seclusion. It was not the rumored Aegon, once called Young Griff, who had disappeared amid the War of the Five Kings. Nor was it the once famed Daenerys Stormborn, whose fall had been witnessed by many. Instead, it was a child sired in secrecy, an offspring Daenerys had never known she had. The child's existence was hidden among loyalists and friends who once served the Mother of Dragons. Led by a few trusted souls, the infant was spirited away from the chaos that ensued after the final battles, sheltered in the far corners of Essos where prying eyes rarely looked. Her name was Sarah Targaryen, after the old Targaryen tradition of reusing cherished names, though she herself had never donned the crown or commanded armies. She lived in Braavos in relative anonymity, shielded by a small cadre who believed that, one day, a Targaryen might yet sit the Iron Throne, if the right circumstances arose. As Sarah grew to womanhood, she learned only fragments of her heritage. The legends of dragons, the triumphant and tragic history of her house, and the burdens that came with the Targaryen name. Her guardians did not feed her illusions of grandeur. She was taught to keep her identity hidden, for the rulers of Westeros would likely snuff out any possible Targaryen challenge the moment they caught wind of it. Yet something stirred in her blood, in her dreams. She dreamed of dragons, of shadowy wings cutting across pale moons and blazing skies. She dreamed of cold winds that fought against her flames, of white-blue eyes staring into hers with eerie recognition. As the years passed, these dreams grew more vivid. Sometimes she would wake in a sweat, her body on fire with an internal heat she couldn't explain. Other times, she felt a longing for something beyond her cramped life in Braavos, beyond the horizon of the free city. Though she had never set foot in Westeros, she felt it calling her. A day came when a stranger arrived, a man with hair the color of smoke. In the gloom of a Braavosi tavern, he sought out her guardians. He bore tidings, an unsettling rumor from the distant north, of a re-emergent threat the living had faced once before. He also brought an unearthly shard of ice, swirling with faint blue luminescence. He claimed it came from a wight he had encountered in a remote northern port where the seas froze even in summer. He whispered that the White Walkers were stirring, and that an old power was stirring with them, the power that dwarfed mortal conceptions of life and death. That man, revealed only as a mercenary once employed in the retinues of the old Targaryen loyalists, looked upon Sarah with an appraising, almost reverential gaze. "Mother of Dragons," he said in a trembling voice, refusing to call her by her real name, as if not daring to speak it aloud. In that moment, she felt something burn in her chest, as if a spark leapt from the shard of ice to the Targaryen fire in her veins. In the weeks that followed, against all counsel, she resolved to sail for Westeros. A small band of the loyal accompanied her, unwilling to let this last Targaryen heir vanish into the unknown unguarded. They arrived at a frozen, windswept cove on the eastern coast of the north, skirting the usual ports to avoid detection. Stepping onto Westerosi soil for the first time, Sarah felt a strange mix of trepidation and destiny. She was no conqueror, she had no dragons, but still, her dreams had guided her here, and something, some force or presence, seemed to beckon her northward. Trekking through endless leagues of snow-laden forest, the group evaded both honest rangers and unscrupulous brigands. Rumors reached them as they traveled. Villages in the far north had been found empty, doors swinging on broken hinges, animals left half-eaten in the fields. Fragments of ice crystals were found embedded in walls, as if some otherworldly cold had seeped in. Whispers of whites and shimmering figures in the night set every fire-lit story abuzz with fear. At last, the group approached the battered remains of the wall. The great fortification that had stood for thousands of years was still partially collapsed in several areas from the previous war, never fully restored. To the south, guard towers had been built in an effort to keep watch, but the resources of the realm had grown thin, and full protection was impossible. Sarah's party slipped through one of the ruined sections, clambering over broken ice and ancient stone. Once on the other side, they found themselves in a realm of almost unearthly silence. The wind moaned across empty expanses, rattling naked trees. The footprints of men and beasts were faint, erased by drifting snow. Even the crows seemed wary of venturing too far. They made camp in a sheltered hollow among a cluster of stunted pines. Night fell early. The cold was so intense that the flames of their campfire seemed feeble. Yet Sarah felt drawn. There was no rational explanation for it. She only sensed that if she went far enough north, she might find the answers to her nightmares. That night, her dreams came alive once more. A swirl of images, icy shadows, a tall figure with skin as pale as the moon, wearing a crown of frost. In the dream, that being beckoned to her, a silent invitation. She was not afraid. She felt an odd, inexplicable kinship. Come dawn, her guardians awakened to find her standing on the edge of the camp, gazing northward with a distant look in her violet eyes. She told them, in a voice that carried authority she had rarely used, that she must travel onward alone. They protested, swearing to protect her. But she commanded them to remain behind, to wait. Something pulled her forward, she insisted. Something that might be disastrous to face en masse. In the end, loyalty and fear of Targaryen wrath won out. Her guardians yielded, forging a hidden camp while she pressed forward with only a single companion, the mercenary who had brought the shard of ice, who called himself Taryn. He insisted that he could not, in good conscience, leave her to wander alone, and she respected his courage. They moved north for days. Sunlight grew scarce, as if the sky itself diminished under an ancient gloom. At times, they glimpsed shapes on the horizon, figures that melted into the snowy backdrop. They felt eyes upon them, watchers from the icy wastes. Where the forest gave way to open tundra, they found shallow graves and ragged remains that told of small battles. Frozen corpses dotted the terrain, some missing limbs, some with unnaturally pale skin. Sarah tried not to shrink from these sights, though her heart pounded with dread at the understanding that the undead were no longer a rumor. One morning, as they traversed a ridge overlooking a wide expanse of snowy plain, they beheld a sight that shocked them both. Thousands of figures stood assembled upon the ice, some living, some not. White walkers, tall and regal, gazed upon a mass of whites that shifted and swayed. And in their midst, astride an undead horse, was a being crowned with a coronet of ice. The Night King. He did not move like a mindless wight, nor did he roar or rage. He was still poised, exuding a glacial menace more terrifying than any howling beast. Taryn whispered a curse under his breath. "We have to get out of here," he said. "This is madness. No mortal can stand against that. We should warn the realm." But Sarah stood transfixed, her breath catching in her chest. She could feel the presence, the same presence she felt in her dreams. She felt more than fear, she felt recognition. Somehow, in a way she could not explain, it was as though she had known him or he had known her for centuries. Like fire meeting ice, they were drawn together, locked in a cosmic interplay older than the memory of men. The Night King turned his head, and though the distance was great, she felt his chilling gaze meet hers. It was as if a jolt of cold lightning ran through her veins. Taryn pulled at her cloak, urging her to retreat. She did not move, her eyes locked on that silent figure, who raised one hand, fingers curled in a gesture that might have been beckoning or commanding. All around him, the White Walkers stirred, a faint rattle of armor and weapons carrying across the frozen plain. She would never fully understand what compelled her in that moment. Later, she would call it fate, or the inescapable bonds of magic that linked their essences, dragonfire and unending ice. She shrugged off Taryn's grip and stepped forward on the ridge. Snow crunched beneath her boots, echoing the pounding of her heart. On the plain below, the Night King slid from his mount with preternatural grace, footprints leaving no mark on the powdery snow. Slowly he advanced. Taryn, gripped by a mixture of terror and unyielding loyalty, drew his sword, even though it trembled in his hand. The White Walkers stood in ranks. None approached as though awaiting some signal. Sarah took another step forward. Taryn placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shook her head. "Stay," she murmured. Her breath smoked in the cold air, a thin white cloud that caught the faint sunlight. She descended the slope alone, stumbling occasionally as she navigated the slick ground. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Each step seemed to carry her deeper into a place where the boundary between life and death blurred. The Night King continued his slow approach, that same gesture extended, as though inviting her forward. They met at the bottom of the slope, perhaps 20 paces apart. Time slowed. The wind fell silent. Sarah dared to raise her chin, meeting that frost-rimed gaze. He did not speak. He never had, at least in any language men understood. Yet in that hush, she felt a swirl of sensations in her mind, like the half-formed thoughts of a slumbering god awakening. She felt a deep well of cold, an emptiness that had endured for millennia. She felt the faint echoes of grief, of rage at the living and the warmth they possessed. And she sensed something else, curiosity. Then came the shudder of recognition. She could almost hear an unspoken question. "Targaryen? Fire? Why do you seek me?" Memories of her lineage, her dreams, flashed through her mind. In that silent communion, she found herself bearing her deepest uncertainty. She thought of dragons, of the light of living flame of the old enemies. The others, the White Walkers, and how her ancestors had always stood for the warmth that opposed the long night. But she felt no mortal terror now. Instead, she perceived an opportunity. For centuries, fire and ice had clashed, neither side ever fully triumphing. Yet here they stood again, in the winter of the world, locked in that ancient dance. She did not know how long she stood before him, trembling in the swirl of intangible thoughts. Then, with ponderous deliberation, the Night King stepped closer. She could smell the cold radiating from him, an arctic dryness that prickled her nose. His outstretched hand hovered above hers. It was a hand with flesh as pale as milk, but she knew that flesh was as cold and unyielding as ice. She swallowed hard, extending her own. The moment their fingers touched, a shock ran through her. Fire meeting ice, forging a bridge of crackling power. She gasped, unable to pull away, though every human instinct told her to recoil from that deadly chill. Yet something in the Targaryen blood warred against it, blazing in her veins, refusing to be snuffed out. Taryn watched in horror from the ridge, prepared to rush to her aid, but transfixed by what he saw. The air around the two figures shimmered, as if fighting currents of hot and cold twisted together. A faint fog swirled up, wreathing them both. Sarah staggered but did not fall. She locked eyes with the Night King, and in his pupils of glacial blue, she witnessed shifting images, visions of endless darkness, swirling snow, and the slow, inevitable march of death across the face of the earth. In that communion, she grasped something deeper. The Night King was not just a mindless enemy. He was bound by an ancient purpose, forged by the children of the forest in ages past to combat the spread of humanity. But that purpose had twisted over time, shaped by malevolent forces into a singular obsession to drown the world in cold oblivion. For centuries, it had been unstoppable, until it encountered Dragonflame and the living's last stand. And now, fate or some deeper magic had brought him back. Yet, this time there was a difference. This time, there was a Targaryen who came not to incinerate him outright, but to learn. whether by design or by the raw, unbridgeable differences of their natures. A bargain of sorts took shape in that silent, chilling union. It was as though each recognized in the other a force that could alter the pattern. A lone tear, hot against her cold bruised cheek, fell from Sarah's eye as she felt fear, sorrow, and an unnameable sense of acceptance well up in her. The tear froze before it hit the ground. The Night King inclined his head, a subtle gesture that might have been the closest he could come to empathy. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand from hers, stepping back. The shimmering haze faded. A hush blanketed the plain. The assembled White Walkers remained motionless, their ranks unbroken. No wight so much as stirred. Taryn began to breathe again, unaware that he had been holding his breath until that moment. Sarah stood amidst the swirling snow, and though she shivered, she felt an undeniable new presence within her. A sliver of the Night King's essence, reciprocating her own blazing spark. Without a word, the Night King turned and strode back among the ranks of his minions. They parted for him, leaving a path. Slowly, they began to move, an organized assembly heading westward. Sarah watched them disappear into the haze of blowing snow. Her heart thundered with a confusion of emotions. She had seen a piece of the truth, but no clarity on how it might resolve. Taryn stumbled down to her, wrapping her in a heavy cloak. "What in the name of all the gods? Are you hurt? You're ice cold." He clasped her hands. Her fingers felt like frozen marble. She did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the dire tie-in in which the Night King had gone. Finally, she turned to him. "We need to follow," she whispered, her lips chapped and trembling. "Follow? Gods, are you mad? Did you see that army? That was the Night King. We should ride south and raise the alarm. This is—" Sarah shook her head. "No, there's something more here." She paused, struggling to find the words to describe the sense that had ignited in her soul. "He didn't kill us. He didn't raise the dead against us. He recognized me." Taryn stared, aghast. "That doesn't mean we should trust him. He's death incarnate. He nearly ended the world the last time. If he has an army of whites again, the living will stand no chance. We have to warn the North. Let them muster their forces. There's no time to lose." She placed a hand on his forearm, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that belied her shaking body. "If we go south now, do you really think the Southern Lords will believe us? Remember what happened the last time warnings about the White Walkers came. They delayed, they denied, they fought their petty wars. By the time they acknowledged the danger, half of Westeros was in flames or frozen. And even if they do believe us, how do we fight something that was already beaten once and still returned?" Silence hung between them, Taryn's breath visible in a cloud. Finally, he swallowed hard. "Then what do you propose?" She glanced north, toward the swirling snow. "We find out what he wants. We find out if there's a way to keep him from destroying us all. Maybe there is none. Maybe I'm chasing a fool's hope. But I can't ignore what just happened." She closed her eyes, remembering that brief resonance of cold power against her own. "He's searching for something. If we don't learn why, we'll be blindsided." Reluctantly, Taryn nodded. "The second we see whites massing to march south, we leave, yes?" Sarah exhaled. "We'll do whatever we must to protect the realm. Promise." They trailed the Night King's forces for days, keeping a safe distance. The landscape was desolate, with eerie echoes of wind across shattered forests and frozen streams. Though the undead army's pace was steady, they always seemed just out of reach. Taryn used all his skill as a tracker to keep them from being discovered, skirting ridges and using natural cover. On occasion, they glimpsed White Walkers scanning the horizon, yet no ambush or pursuit occurred. It was as if the others sensed Sarah's presence, but allowed her to come at her own pace. During this journey, Sarah noticed that the cold no longer bit her the way it once did. The chilling wind still stung her cheeks and reddened her nose, but deep within her core, she felt a curious equilibrium. It was as though the Targaryen fire in her blood and the sliver of ice from her encounter with the Night King were balancing each other. She barely needed the furs Taryn insisted she wear. She could stride through snowdrifts with minimal discomfort, even as Taryn shivered in multiple layers. They encountered small clusters of the undead as they traveled. Reanimated animals, lonely wights patrolling the edges of the Night King's dominion. Yet these creatures did not attack them. Some turned hollow-eyed gazes upon them before continuing on their rounds. Taryn felt unnerved by this unspoken acceptance. Sarah remained focused on her silent mission, trusting her instincts. Each night, she was plagued by more dreams. Icy thrones, swirling frost-laden storms, fleeting glimpses of dragons made of frosted glass. Eventually, the undead army vanished into a colossal valley of ice that lay in the shadow of a ring of jagged mountains. The crags were draped in permanent snow, their peaks shrouded by clouds. Sarah and Taryn emerged onto a high ledge overlooking an immense canyon, whose floor glimmered with shifting lights, pale blue fires and arcs of unnatural energy. It was there, deep within the glacier, that the Night King had established a new seat of power. They made a hidden camp in an overhang that provided shelter from the ceaseless wind. From that vantage, they observed wights moving in measured patrols, ice spiders scuttling across the crevasses, and white walkers striding gracefully among them. Every motion seemed part of a larger design, though its purpose remained opaque. The living watchers could only guess at what the undead master planned. Then, on the second night in that overhang, Taryn shook Sarah awake. She bolted upright to see a tall, pale form standing at the edge of their meager fire's light. A white walker, bearing a wickedly curved blade of crystalline ice. Instantly, Taryn seized his sword, but the walker raised a hand, a gesture reminiscent of the Night King's, as though commanding peace. Uncertain, Taryn hesitated, blade half drawn. The walker stepped forward, and in the trembling light, Sarah saw the reflection of flames dancing in its cold eyes. It turned its gaze to her specifically, ignoring Taryn's hostility. Then it pointed down the slope toward the valley. It was a gesture of summoning. Sarah's heart pounded. Her mouth felt dry. She met Taryn's panicked glance. In that moment, something in her mind clicked, as though it were the next piece of an inevitable chain of events. She nodded slowly. "Let me go," she said. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. "Absolutely not. We stand together." Her expression softened. "You've done enough. I won't risk you, too. This feels personal. If I don't go, we gain nothing. Let me see what he wants. If I don't return by dawn, do what you must, warn the realm, run, anything. But if I do return, perhaps we will have answers." Taryn pressed his lips together in grim reluctance. He saw the resolve in her eyes. She was Targaryen, after all, and the scion of a line famed for boldness and madness in equal measure. He realized there was no swaying her. Nodding stiffly, he lowered his sword. "I'll be waiting," he said, his voice catching. Sarah carefully stepped toward the white walker, who pivoted and glided away, leading her down a winding path. Her boots crunched softly in the snow, each footstep echoing her heartbeat. She followed the walker across a labyrinth of crevasses and ice bridges, descending deeper into the hidden valley. Occasionally, she sensed wights lurking at the periphery of her vision, but none drew near. It felt as though some higher order, or perhaps the Night King's direct will, held them at bay. Eventually, they reached a smooth path of polished ice, leading into an opening in the glacier wall. Pale, flickering torches lined the way, their flames fed by some unknown fuel that burned icy blue rather than orange. The walker vanished into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone at the threshold. She took a breath, steeling herself, and entered. The corridor beyond was silent except for the drip of water from icicles, echoing like a distant chime. The walls were translucent in places, forming surreal tableaus of shapes and swirling patterns. She advanced carefully, each step taking her deeper into the glacier's heart. Then she emerged into a grand chamber, a cavern of ice that seemed shaped by neither mortal nor natural hand. It was vast, the ceiling a frosty dome studded with shards that caught and refracted the eerie blue glow into 1,000 slivers of light. At the center stood a dais carved from a single massive block of ice. Upon it rested a throne, and seated there was the Night King. He looked larger here, in his element, the faint light dancing on his colorless skin. In one hand he held a spear of crackling ice. With the other he beckoned her forward. A tremor shot through her limbs. She recalled old tales of kings and queens bending the knee before the Iron Throne. Yet this was no living king, and the empire he presided over was death itself. She approached, her footsteps echoing in the hush. When she reached the base of the dais, she looked up to meet his gaze. In the unearthly silence, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "Why did you summon me?" He did not speak. Instead, an image formed in her mind, a swirling mass of memories not her own. She saw the forging of the others in the distant past, the creation of the first White Walker by the children of the forest. She saw betrayal by men, the ravages of war, and the unstoppable march of winter. Then she saw dragons lighting the sky with flame, pushing back the darkness. She felt the ancient hatred and fear that the others held for Dragonfire, the one force that could truly challenge them. But as the vision continued, it shifted. She saw glimpses of the war for the dawn, how the living had joined forces, how the dragons had nearly annihilated the White Walkers. She sensed a deep, piercing loneliness emanating from the Night King. The final blow that destroyed his body had cast a shadow over the magic animating him, but had not fully ended it. In the quiet centuries that followed, that cold consciousness had drifted, searching for a means to resurrect itself. The vision sped forward. She saw how traces of that power collected in hidden pockets of ice and snow, lying dormant until the conditions were right. She saw a spark that reached out across the sea, touching the blood of House Targaryen, drawn by a link older and deeper than mortal histories remembered. In that moment, she realized that the Targaryens, with their bond to fire, had once been integral to sealing away the others. But their link to magic cut both ways. Now, that magic had become a bridge for the Night King's return. In a final, dazzling flash of images, she glimpsed a possible future. A world covered in ice, the living enslaved or destroyed, and at the Night King's side, an heir of fire and ice. A queen with hair like silver and eyes like amethysts, commanding an army of undead dragons. A frozen empire, unstoppable and eternal. Then the vision faded, and she stood trembling before the dais. Her lungs burned as she gasped for breath. She realized with dawning horror that in the Night King's mind, she was not merely an enemy. She was a potential partner, a key to forging a new destiny that merged their powers. Taryn's words came to her. He's death incarnate. He nearly ended the world the last time. But some part of her, born of the Targaryen thirst for power, or perhaps some more altruistic corner of her heart, asked if there was another path. Did this vision of a frozen empire necessarily mean the annihilation of the living? Or could a balance be struck? She recalled the glimmer of curiosity she had felt in the Night King's presence. There was something more than raw malice. There was purpose, shaped by eons of conflict. Her mind raced. She was no queen, no conqueror. She had no dragons under her command. But she did have the Targaryen bloodline, the vestige of fire that might counter or complement this ancient cold. If she simply refused him, would he forcibly take what he sought? Or was there a chance to negotiate a peace? She lifted her head to meet his gaze once more. "What do you want of me?" she asked, voice echoing in the chamber. In response, he rose from the throne. Slowly, he extended a hand, reminiscent of that first moment on the plain. She felt the chill radiating across the distance. In her mind, she sensed a powerful intent, as though he were offering to share the secrets of his magic. The significance was overwhelming. He, the embodiment of the Great Other, was inviting her to join him, to merge her Targaryen flame with the ancient ice. Sarah's knees threatened to buckle. She took one step back, trying to anchor herself. "You would have me become what? A White Walker queen?" The thought sent a shiver through her. Would that mean discarding her humanity? Would she become an undead abomination? She felt the swirl of images again. though less forceful. A new image emerged. Her standing beside him, crowned with ice and fire, commanding the dead and the living. The sense she got was that she need not die to hold this power. She could remain living, but would be bound to his power as he would be bound to hers. The final bridging of ice and fire. At that, Sarah closed her eyes, grappling with the moral weight of it. The realm would see her as a monster. They would rise against her. Perhaps this was the reason Targaryens had historically used dragons for dominance. Men would bow to fire. But if she allied with the White Walkers, she would not be greeted as a liberator. She would be seen as an existential threat. Yet the vision also hinted at a new kind of rule, an empire that might spare humanity the horrors of a war with the undead. If the living bent the knee willingly to the crown of ice and fire, perhaps the White Walkers would not cull them as they had in the past. She felt a flicker of something that might be hope or naivety. Taking a trembling breath, she spoke again. "If I do this, do we spare the living?" Her words echoed in the ice chamber. He did not reply verbally, but another wave of images came, these more ambiguous. Men swearing fealty in exchange for survival, cold nights stretching on. The sun diminished but not entirely lost, a quiet hush over the land. Yet there was also violence. Some houses resisted, some pockets of the living rebelled, and the White Walkers crushed them. She realized that the Night King would not simply spare every life out of mercy. Those who resisted would face annihilation. Only subservience would be tolerated. The realm might never again know the bright summers of old. The world would be locked in perpetual winter, albeit a controlled one. The frozen empire would mark an entirely new epoch of existence, a middle ground between total extinction and free, vibrant life. She hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. The magnitude of the choice felt crushing. She thought of her guardians, waiting to see if she would return. Thought of Taryn, risking his life to keep her safe. Thought of all the people who lived ignorant of the threat on their doorstep. Was she truly contemplating forging a compact with the Night King? Her father's blood whispered in her ear of power, of how Targaryens had once commanded the might of dragons to unify the realm. Perhaps forging unity with the White Walkers was a monstrous inversion of that tradition, but still an echo of it. She could see the pitfalls of refusing as well. The last time the living fought him, half the realm was devastated, and that was when they had dragons. Now, the last known dragons were gone. The living might not stand a chance against a newly risen host of the dead. Eyes still damp, Sarah turned her gaze back to the Night King. Very softly, she whispered, "I accept." The air grew colder, as though the glacier exhaled. A swirl of light flashed across the icy walls, and the Night King descended from the dais, each step echoing like the toll of a distant bell. His outstretched hand hovered before her, and this time, there was no hesitation. She lifted her hand. Their fingers met. The cold was indescribable, an immediate assault on her senses. She thought she might black out, but then the Targaryen flame in her veins surged, pushing back the frost. The combined magic crackled around them, white steam rising from their clasped hands. His glacial power flowed through her, and her fiery essence coursed into him. She sensed an age-old barrier giving way, as if some cosmic tension that had kept ice and fire at odds was melting into a new alignment. She felt her breath catch in her throat. The moment extended, timeless. Then she gasped, staggering backward. In her chest, a new force pulsed. Her heart hammered as if on fire and frozen at once. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the Night King's bright, inhuman eyes gazing into hers. Then darkness claimed her. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on a smooth slab of ice. The Night King stood nearby, silent as ever. At the edges of her vision, White Walkers lingered, watchful. She felt changed, though she couldn't quite define how. Lifting a hand to her face, she saw that her fingertips were pale, and when she touched the floor, frost spread from her skin. Yet she did not feel cold. Instead, she felt a curious mixture of warmth and chill coexisting. Rising unsteadily to her feet, she turned to the Night King. "What have I become?" she breathed. Still, there was no spoken reply. Instead, she sensed the bond. Where once he felt distant and alien, she now perceived his presence like a voice in the back of her mind. The White Walkers, too, she could faintly sense, as though each had a shimmering thread connecting them to her. She realized, with a trembling awe, that she had become an integral part of their hive mind. She had not died. She was not a white, yet she was entwined with their magic. She retained her free will, her mind, but carried the Night King's essence like a brand upon her soul. Her Targaryen side flared in response, not smothered but transformed. The silver in her hair took on a faint glimmer, almost like frost. Her eyes now held flecks of icy blue dancing among the violet. Fire and ice merged at last. She drew in a shaky breath. "I can feel them," she said, almost to herself. "All of them. The whites, the White Walkers. They're alive, no, not alive, but they're connected." She let her gaze rove over the watchers in the chamber. She detected no immediate hostility, only curiosity and, beneath that, unwavering obedience. The Night King gazed at her, and an image formed in her mind. The wide sweep of the valley beyond, the armies of the dead standing in readiness, waiting for a word or command. Then she saw a grand vision of a throne made of ice and dragonbone, perched in the heart of Winterfell, the seat of a new empire that stretched across the continent. 1,000 years of winter, tempered by the last living scion of House Targaryen. Sarah's lips parted, a new awareness flooding her. Was this truly the path she had chosen? Could she still turn back? The bond felt permanent, or at least not easily severed. She recalled a child's fairy tale, once told to her in Bravos, about a fisherman who made a deal with a sea demon. The moral had been, bargains with inhuman powers rarely end as one hopes. Yet here she stood. There was no undoing it now. A flush of resolve straightened her spine. If she truly had the ear or mind of the Night King, perhaps she could influence him to spare the realm from utter ruin. There would be a price, no doubt. An entire shift of the social and political order. Many would die resisting, but perhaps, in the end, more might live than if the Night King marched south unopposed. Thus began the forging of a frozen empire. In the days that followed, Sarah tested the boundaries of her new powers. She learned she could command whites with a silent impulse, guiding them to simple tasks. She could sense their presence within a radius that extended out for miles, and by focusing, she could connect to the minds of nearby White Walkers, exchanging fragments of thought or images. And always, behind it all, lay the Night King's vast consciousness, like a silent sentinel. He did not direct her with words or demands. He simply existed in tandem with her, sharing his power while absorbing her living essence. It was a merger that felt deeply intimate and irrevocably alien. Taryn's reaction was as predictable as it was heartbreaking. When she finally reappeared at the vantage point, he almost attacked her, thinking she was a white in the shape of his friend. But she quieted him, speaking in her own voice, showing that she was not dead. He stared in disbelief at her changed appearance, her shimmering hair and eyes touched by frost. And when he realized what she had done, that she de-allied with the Night King, his shock turned to horror. "You've damned yourself," he murmured, stepping away as though she burned him. "The realm will call you an abomination." She lowered her gaze. "I made a choice to save lives," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. If he marched south unchallenged, everything would end. Now, maybe it won't. Or maybe it will be worse, he said bitterly. You might be unleashing a tyranny of eternal winter. How many will die? How many will refuse to bend? She swallowed the lump in her throat. I will try to guide them, away from total destruction. With my voice in his mind, perhaps he'll see another way. If he's truly unstoppable, this is the best chance we have. Taryn shuddered, wiping the perspiration from his brow. You don't realize what you sound like. How many tyrants claim they do evil for the greater good? The Targaryens once burned entire villages to keep order. What's the difference between that and freezing the land to demand fealty? She had no easy answer. Guilt gnawed at her. I only know that the Night King's return is inevitable, or was inevitable the moment that Ice Shard found me in Bravos. My best hope is to moderate him, to build something stable instead of simply letting him sweep the realm. He turned away, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Then what do you expect me to do? Return south and spread the word of your new alliance? She hesitated. If you do, they'll gather armies which the White Walkers can crush. That will lead to massive bloodshed. Perhaps it's better if you speak to them first. Let them know there's another path, if they accept my rule. She swallowed, her stomach turning at hearing her own words. My rule. Tell them not to fight. Tell them to negotiate with me. Taryn clenched his jaw. And if I refuse to play herald for you? She felt the stir of the cold within her, the presence that now shared her being. It wanted her to impose her will to ensure the realm bowed. She fought the urge, forcing compassion into her voice. I would never force you. You're free to go. But for the sake of everyone we fought for, please warn them. Convince them. If they muster an army, it'll be war. And war with the dead seldom ends well for the living. He stood in silence for a long time, eyes flicking between her and the distant, unseen presence of the Night King's legion. At last, he shook his head, eyes betraying sorrow more than anger. I'll go, Sarah, or whatever you are now, but don't expect them to kneel easily. The North fought and bled to stop this evil once before. Even if you call it mercy, they'll see it as a betrayal. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. Then let them know I offer them a choice. Peace under a new order, or war they cannot win. I don't wish to be their enemy. He said nothing more, turning to gather his meager belongings. In minutes, he was gone, trudging south toward the battered remnants of the wall. Sarah stood alone in that deserted vantage point, the wind whipping her cloak. She felt the cold more keenly in that moment, not as a comforting power but as a hollow ache. She wondered if she had truly done the right thing, or if her actions would doom the realm to a slower, more insidious demise. Time would provide the answer. Over the next weeks, the living received warnings. In Winterfell, a free folk scout arrived gasping and half-frozen, bearing a message from Taryn. It told of the new threat of the rumored Winter Queen, a Targaryen in league with the Night King. Some scoffed, suspecting a trick. Others recalled old prophecies of a prince or princess who was promised, only to be shattered by the realization that the new champion of the living had instead allied with the Great Other. Discussions turned heated. Should the North raise its banners? Should they send envoys to treat with this Winter Queen? Jon Stark, a lord in the line of the old kings, led the council. He was justly proud of his Stark heritage and devout in his guardianship of the North. He had grown up with the stories of the Long Night. His father had fought in that war. For him, the idea of forging a peace with the White Walkers seemed impossible. Yet, the memory of the last war's toll gave him pause. If there was any chance to spare his people from the horrors of another onslaught, he had a duty to explore it. In King's Landing, the newly enthroned monarchy dismissed the tale as superstition or, at best, a northern problem. The king's advisors were preoccupied with containing rebellions in the Stormlands and the Reach, which threatened to destabilize the realm's fragile economy. Sending armies north to chase rumors of undead kings was the last thing they wanted. A few, however, remembered the last time Southerners ignored the warnings of the North. Some urgent voices counseled caution, but the Crown's official stance was tepid at best. Meanwhile, Sarah and the Night King consolidated power in the Icy Valley. She learned from the White Walkers how to shape ice in ways that defied nature, forging crystalline structures, reinforcing the valley's walls. Under her direction, no white armies marched on the living, yet, instead, she worked to understand the extent of her new authority. She could direct squads of whites to prepare fortifications, gather resources in the form of driftwood, bones, and shards of dragonglass that littered certain hidden caves in the far north. That last find intrigued her. Dragonglass was lethal to White Walkers, yet they collected it under her orders, shaping it into new forms. Perhaps, she thought, it could be used to forge a balanced power, a key to controlling or neutralizing the undead if needed. She told herself this was for safety, should the Night King's instincts override her pleas. In truth, she wondered if it was merely an excuse to maintain some leverage. Still, the White Walkers carried out her commands without resistance, a silent testament to the melding of her authority with the Night King's. And always, he watched her from a distance, offering neither approval nor contradiction, existing in a realm beyond mortal expressions. She sensed his presence like a deep undertow, guiding the flow of events without constraining her immediate choices. Then came the first envoys from the living. Under a banner of truce, they ventured to the edge of the icy canyon. Sarah, robed in white fur, emerged with a retinue of White Walkers flanking her, their eyes glinting like polished sapphire. The envoys, free folk chieftains, and a few northern lords trembled at the sight. They recognized the creatures that had once slaughtered countless friends and kin, now standing docile at a Targaryen's side. Lord Ryman Reed, a spindly man from the swamps of the Neck, spoke first in a quavering voice. "Winter Queen, we come at the behest of Jon Stark to learn your terms. Is it true you have allied with the Night King?" His eyes flicked nervously to the pale figures arrayed behind her. Sarah's heart beat rapidly. She forced herself to speak with calm she did not entirely feel. "I stand before you as living proof that we need not be enemies. The Night King will not march on the realm so long as we reach an accord. I ask only for recognition of a new sovereignty in the north. Let the living remain under my protection, and his in perpetuity. Yield your fealty, and there need be no war." A chill ran through the envoys, and not just from the frigid air. One chieftain, a weathered spearwife with scars across her face, spat on the ground. "Why should we trade the rule of southern kings for the rule of the dead?" Sarah could not hide the pang that shot through her. "Because the alternative is annihilation," she said grimly. "If you fight us, the living will lose. The North remembers the cost of such a war. The last time we had dragons breathing fire to stand against him. Now there are no dragons, only me." She paused, letting that sink in. "Our rule need not be a curse. I will ensure that humanity endures. We will bring order to the land." The spearwife sneered. "Order under ice? Summer snuffed out forever." Sarah's eyes hardened. "It is better than total extinction." She lowered her voice. "If I had not formed this pact, the Night King would have marched unimpeded, and you know how that story ends." The envoys conferred in hushed voices. Many were clearly torn between outrage and fear. Lord Reed finally stepped forward again. "We will carry your terms to Winterfell and beyond, but understand we are not alone in deciding. The other lords must be heard. They will not kneel easily to a power they see as an abomination." Sarah bowed her head. "I know, but when they understand the stakes, perhaps they will see reason. I do not wish to spill more blood, living or otherwise." She glanced at the silent White Walkers, whose presence reminded everyone of a contradictory truth. These creatures showed no mercy when unleashed. The envoys departed with heavy hearts. As they left, a hush settled over the canyon again. Sarah withdrew to the central ice chamber, where the Night King waited on his throne. She did not need to speak aloud to convey her uncertainty and worry. She felt the stir of his ancient consciousness, cold and unwavering. He would not be moved by mortal pleas for acceptance or democracy. He would allow her negotiations only to the extent that they served his ultimate design: subjugation of the living under a new, eternal winter. She placed a hand on the icy dais. In the reflection, she caught sight of herself. Not quite human, not quite White Walker. The queen of a frozen empire that did not yet exist, perched on the brink of cataclysmic change. She wondered if she had truly made a choice, or if she was merely a vessel for a doom long foretold. News of the Winter Queen's demands rippled across the north. Reactions ranged from horror to resignation. Some elders who had lived through the Great War muttered that perhaps it was better to bow and live than to face the unstoppable White Army again. Others decried it as a betrayal of everything the living stood for, urging the North to fight, no matter the cost. Houses that once bent the knee to the crown found no clear guidance from King's Landing, as the monarchy still dismissed the threat as a northern fairy tale. So the decision lay in the hands of northern leadership. Eventually, Jon Stark convened a grand council in Winterfell, summoning lords, chieftains, and any who could speak for their people. The ancient Great Hall, warmed by roaring fires, was filled with tense faces and hushed conversations. All eyes turned to Jon, a tall man with the dark hair of the Starks and a streak of gray at his temples. He spoke with a measured tone, recounting the envoy's report of the White Walkers assembling anew, of the Targaryen woman now bonded with the Night King, and of her offer, fealty in exchange for survival. The hall erupted in debate. Lord Serwyn demanded they muster armies and reforge alliances with the Vale. Lady Mormont's heir argued for caution, reminding them that the Vale might not come if they thought the threat was exaggerated. Free folk representatives scoffed at kneeling to any monarchy, let alone a half-dead one. An old maester from the Citadel questioned whether the new Targaryen truly had the realm's best interests at heart or simply sought power. At last, Jon Stark raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "I know the legends," he said in a low voice that carried through the hall. "I was taught by those who fought in the Great War, who saw the army of the dead firsthand. If the Night King truly stands at her side, we must assume their power is beyond anything we can muster alone. However, the realm once united to drive him back. Could we not do so again? Summon the forces of the crown, gather the lords of Westeros, and meet them with steel and fire." A twinge of despair crossed his features as he recalled the realm's fractious state. Even if they could rally a combined force, would it arrive in time, and would it be enough without dragons? The hall fell silent as the questions sank in. Eventually, Lord Reed spoke up, voice firm despite his frail appearance. "She claimed that if we do not accept her rule, the Night King will descend upon us all. Perhaps we cannot trust her, but can we afford not to? I've seen what the undead can do." He shivered at the memory. "I'd rather kneel to a living queen, even one touched by death, than watch my people slaughtered and raised as whites." The division in the hall was stark. Some nodded in reluctant agreement. Others bristled at such subjugation. As the council wore on, no consensus formed. At length, Jon Stark sent word that he, with a small retinue, would meet Serra Targaryen himself in parley, to look her in the eyes and judge her intentions. Then, if needed, they would prepare for war. Serra stood on a broad ledge at the base of the glacier, flanked by 2 White Walkers. The dawn sky was a thin, colorless strip behind a veil of clouds. She gazed south, waiting. The air was quiet, the hush broken only by the moan of distant winds weaving through the jagged peaks. She could feel the Night King somewhere behind her, his presence a silent mantle upon her thoughts. He too waited. At last, she saw movement. A small column of riders inching up the path. They carried torches that guttered against the frigid gale. Leading them was Jon Stark, clad in heavy furs, sword at his side. His expression was grim, his gray-streaked hair whipped by the wind. A handful of knights and free folk warriors accompanied him, scanning the surroundings warily. Serra descended to meet them. She had adapted to the cold so fully that she wore only a light mantle of fur over simple leathers. No breath misted from her lips, though the men before her panted clouds into the freezing air. They halted a cautious distance away. Jon Stark dismounted, handing the reins to one of his guards. He approached with deliberate steps, eyes flicking from Serra's changed appearance to her silent White Walker escorts. "So it's true," he said softly, his voice carrying a tinge of sorrow. "You stand with them." She nodded. "I do." The swirl of conflicting emotions rose in her chest. "I'm sorry it came to this, but you must understand. The alternative was the destruction of us all." His jaw tightened. "And what do you call this? A realm bent in subservience to the dead?" He glanced at the White Walkers warily. Serra exhaled slowly. "I call it a compromise. The Night King's armies no longer need to march in slaughter. With me as the bridge, we can coexist. It won't be the same world as before, but it will be a world where men still live, children can be born, and houses can endure. Winter will be everlasting, but not devoid of hope. She looked into his eyes, pleading, "Is that not better than a war we cannot win?" Jon eyed her as if assessing her sincerity. He had an air of quiet authority, reminiscent of the old tales of the Stark line. "There was a time," he said, "when a Targaryen queen fought side by side with the Starks to save the realm from this very threat. Now you ask us to submit to it. How can I reconcile that?" She swallowed. "She was my mother," she confessed in a low voice, though she rarely used that familial term for Daenerys. "I never knew her, but I know what she fought for. If she were here, perhaps she would despise my choice. But she lost her dragons, and we do not have them now. Without them, how do we stand against the Night King? We can't. If we try, it will end in ruin. I won't let the realm burn or freeze if there's another path." His eyes flickered with the mention of Daenerys Targaryen. He shook his head, confusion marring his features. "And you truly believe you can hold him in check? That he will honor any agreement?" She felt the internal chill shift, a ripple in the connection with the Night King. "He is bound to me now as I am bound to him. He will not break faith unless we do. As long as we remain unified, the dead will not sweep south in conquest." Jon was silent a long time, scanning her face for any hint of deception. Around them, his guards stirred anxiously, their horses shifting restlessly in the cold. Finally, he spoke. "I've heard your terms. Bend the knee or face the whites. If we kneel, you promise a winter without an endless horde of the dead." A flicker of shame crossed Sarah's features. "Yes, it's not a pleasant choice, I grant you, but it's the only one that spares lives." He closed his eyes briefly, as though wrestling with his conscience. "Then I will bow, if it means keeping my people safe." There were murmurs of shock from his men. "But do not expect all of the North to follow me willingly. Some will rebel, and if you crush them, any hope of trusting you will be lost." She nodded. "I understand. I'll do what I can to prevent needless bloodshed. But if they attack, the White Walkers will defend themselves." She considered a moment, then lowered her voice. "Will you speak to the other lords, help them see reason? If I have your support, perhaps they will bend the knee without violence." Jon bowed his head, sorrow in his expression. "I will do what must be done to protect the realm, even if that means forging this pact with darkness. But I fear the realm may never forgive me, or you." Sarah accepted his words with a heavy heart. She reached out, almost touching his shoulder, then drew back, remembering how unnatural her touch might feel. "Thank you. You do what any true Stark would, place the North above personal pride." He let out a long, weary breath. "May the gods forgive us," he said, then turned to his men. "We ride to Winterfell. Summon the banners. This is the choice we face. Bend to the Winter Queen's rule or prepare for the dead's onslaught." And so the first major house of the North gave in, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of the old foe that had once nearly ended the world. It was not a triumphant moment, no cheering or saluting. It was a bleak bargain, made under the relentless gray sky. Word spread quickly of Jon Stark's acquiescence, fueling alarm and outrage among other northern houses. Some accused him of cowardice, others of betrayal. Yet the memory of the last war with the dead still loomed large, and many realized that if the Starks were bowing, the threat must be dire indeed. A wave of uncertain submission followed among several smaller houses. Others, more proud or skeptical, openly declared they would never kneel to an undead king and his Targaryen consort. The realm teetered on the brink of civil war within the North, humans divided over how to confront an impossible ultimatum. King's Landing, upon hearing the North's predicament, faced a dilemma. If the North truly fell under the sway of this frozen empire, the crown would lose a vast portion of its dominion, and perhaps face a threat that could one day march south. Some advisors urged the king to mount a grand offensive, while others counseled sending an emissary to treat with the Night King's queen directly. As the debate raged in the Red Keep, chaos unfolded across Westeros, with lords maneuvering for position, uncertain how or when the undead might appear on their doorstep. In that swirling maelstrom of doubt and fear, Sarah wrestled with the consequences of each new development. She felt the mounting tension in the Night King's presence, sensed his gathering impatience. The same primal force that once drove him to sweep across the land was stirring. He tolerated her negotiations only because he saw them as a faster path to subjugation than open war. But the moment it seemed the living would resist indefinitely, she sensed he would unleash his full might, heedless of her pleas. She walked the perimeter of the icy canyon, passing silently among whites and white walkers. She felt their deference, their acceptance of her as an extension of the Night King's will. Yet she could not shake the feeling that a single misstep, a single moment of rebellion, would turn them against her. They were not creatures of compromise, but of ancient purpose. Only her bond with the Night King held them in check. One day, as she was studying a shelf of dragonglass shards her minions had collected, she felt a sudden wave of cold surge through her bond. She turned sharply, seeing the Night King standing at the entrance to the chamber. He glided forward, silent, and raised a hand, showing her an image in her mind. Houses in the far north refusing to bend, raising their banners in open defiance. Among them was House Umber, House Glover, and others who had sworn loyalty to the Starks but now believed the Starks had been compromised. They were mustering forces, calling on old pacts with smaller houses. A ragtag army formed, determined to drive away the new threat or die trying. Her heart sank. She could almost see the Night King's intention: crush them before they rallied further. This was the unstoppable tide of winter. Yet she also perceived that if he marched an undead host on them, it would confirm the realm's worst fears, potentially driving everyone else to resist, culminating in an all-out war that would devastate the living. She forced her voice to remain calm. "I will go to them," she said, hoping he could sense her meaning. "Let me speak to them first. If I cannot sway them, then—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the grim alternative. The Night King inclined his head, an inscrutable gesture. She sensed his agreement, reluctant, but real. He would give her a chance to bring them to heal peacefully, but not forever. If they refused, he would mobilize. Summoning a White Walker escort, Sarah set out toward the rebellious houses, hoping desperately to avert tragedy. Whether they would listen or if she even deserved their trust, she could not say. The deepening winter lay before her, the embodiment of a choice she had made, a choice that would echo through the ages to come. And with every step, she felt the cold and fire intertwined in her blood, the steady pulse of a new empire's heart, waiting to be born.